So, Brandon, we've talked about the office of elder, we've talked about the qualifications, we talked about the function,
Yeah,
but we also know that God established the office of deacon. So,
right.
so where did that start, and what are some of the qualifications and functions of the deacons?
Yeah. So we think that the office of deacon started in Acts 6. And the reason I say we think is because it's a descriptive passage that's telling us a story. And the story is in the early church, there was an issue where certain people in the church were not receiving benefits. It was food distribution, whether it be communion or food pantry. And it was the Greek speaking Christians. And they felt like they weren't being treated fairly. And so they
Right.
came to the apostles and said, "Hey, can you fix this problem?" And the apostles said, "Listen, this is not our job. Our job is to devote ourselves to the word of God and prayer." And so what they did was they didn't neglect the problem. They appointed 7 men who were filled with the Spirit to specifically address this issue. And we think that's where deacons started, because then that's how we see the deacons functioning in the New Testament, is meeting the tangible needs of the church so the elders can do their job.
Yeah, so we see it initiated in Acts chapter 6 based on needs of the church,
Right.
based on the function that the apostles were then carrying out in the church.
Right.
And so then we fast forward to some letter from Paul, this letter from Paul in First Timothy
Yeah.
that gives the distinctions between the overseers and the deacons, and also gives some specifics to the role of deacons. So what are those specifics?
Yeah, so it's in the letters of Paul where the office of deacon is solidified. We see in First Timothy chapter 3, first 7 verses, he addresses what overseers should be and do. And then in verse 8 through 13, he addresses what deacons should look like and be and do. And so that makes it very clear these are formal offices. Essentially, Paul is telling his young protege Timothy, listen, this is what you're to look for in overseers. This is what you're to look for in deacons as you're appointing leaders in your church. And the deacons, very much like the elders, they have to be people who are men and women of character, godly people. They have to be called by God to do this work. But the difference there is that the deacons are not in a position of authority. They're not
Right.
in a position where they're called to teach the word of God. They can teach the word of God, but that's not their primary function. Their primary function is to serve the needs of the church, primarily to free up the elders to do the work of their
Right. So
ministry.
the word deacon is actually diakonos, which
Yeah,
it just means
servant.
servant.
Yeah,
It's a servant of the church to alleviate some of the responsibility of caring for the flock
that's right.
so that the elders can then dig into the word, prepare sermons, lead the flock, teach the flock, shepherd the flock.
Yeah, and I've heard them referred to before, and this is so good. They're shock absorbers.
Yeah.
They're taking the tension, they're taking the pressure off of the church, they're taking the pressure off of the elders, so that people can do what they're called to do for God.
Yeah. It's good.